Welcome to my channel, Marxism Schmarxism, and this is a new audiobook for you today. This is Vladimir Lenin's The Question of Nationalities or Autonomisation that he wrote in late 1922. In reality, Lenin spoke it to Maria Volodicheva, and she wrote it down. It's an important text because it gives Marxists a better understanding of the later Lenin's understanding of what the USSR really was. This text may be shocking for many because inside of it, Lenin admits that the Bolshevik Revolution never truly smashed the bourgeois czarist state, saying that the current Soviet state is, quote, still quite alien to us. He then tries to give measures to be taken that may solve this problem. In other parts of the text, he criticizes Soviet statesmen for violence against non-Russians in the Soviet Union, and also tries to elaborate on proletarian internationalism. So without further ado, I will begin. I suppose I have been very remiss with respect to the workers of Russia for not having intervened energetically and decisively enough in the notorious question of autonomization, which, it appears, is officially called the question of the Soviet Socialist Republics. When this question arose last summer, I was ill, and then in autumn I relied too much on my recovery and on the October and December plenary meetings giving me an opportunity of intervening in this question. However, I did not manage to attend the October plenary meeting when this question came up, or the one in December, and so the question passed me by almost completely. I have only had time for a talk with Comrade Dzerzhinsky, who came from the Caucasus and told me how this matter stood in Georgia. I have also managed to exchange a few words with Comrade Zinoviev and express my apprehensions on this matter. From what I was told by Comrade Dzerzhinsky, who is at the head of the commission sent by the CC to investigate the Georgian incident, I could only draw the greatest apprehensions. If matters had come to such a pass that Ordzhonikidze could go to the extreme of applying physical violence, as Comrade Dzerzhinsky informed me, we can imagine what a mess we have gotten ourselves into. Obviously, the whole business of autonomization was radically wrong and badly timed. It is said that a united apparatus was needed. Where did that assurance come from? Did it not come from that same Russian apparatus which, as I pointed out in one of the preceding sections of my diary, we took over from Tsarism and slightly anointed with Soviet oil? There is no doubt that that measure should have been delayed somewhat until we could say that we vouched for our apparatus as our own. But now we must in all conscience admit the contrary. The apparatus we call ours is, in fact, still quite alien to us. It is a bourgeois and czarist hodgepodge, and there has been no possibility of getting rid of it in the course of the past 5 years without the help of other countries, and because we have been busy most of the time with military engagements and the fight against famine. It is quite natural that in such circumstances the freedom to secede from the Union, by which we justify ourselves, will be a mere scrap of paper, unable to defend the non-Russians from the onslaught of that really Russian man, the great Russian chauvinist, in substance a rascal and a tyrant, such as the typical Russian bureaucrat is. There is no doubt that the infinitesimal percentage of Soviet and Sovietized workers will drown in that tide of chauvinistic great Russian riffraff like a fly in milk. It is said in defense of this measure that the People's Commissariats, directly concerned with national psychology and national education, were set up as separate bodies. But there the question arises, can these people commissariats be made quite independent? And secondly, were we careful enough to take measures to provide the non-Russians with a real safeguard against the truly Russian bully? I do not think we took such measures, although we could and should have done so. I think that Stalin's haste and his infatuation with pure administration, together with his spite against the notorious nationalist socialism, played a fatal role here. There's a comment from Marxists Internet Archives. Stalin criticized the minority nations for not being internationalist because they did want to unite with Russia. In politics, spite generally plays the basest of roles. I also fear that Comrade Dzerzhinsky, who went to the Caucasus to investigate the crime of those nationalist socialists, distinguished himself there by his truly Russian frame of mind. It is common knowledge that people of other nationalities who have become Russified overdo this Russian frame of mind, and that the impartiality of his whole commission was typified well enough by Ordzhonikidze's manhandling. I think that no provocation or even insult can justify such Russian manhandling, and that Comrade Dzerzhinsky was inexcusably guilty in adopting a light-hearted attitude towards it. For all the citizens in the Caucasus, Ordzhonikidze was the authority. Ordzhonikidze had no right to display that irritability to which he and Dzerzhinsky referred. On the contrary, Ordzhonikidze should have behaved with a restraint which cannot be demanded of any ordinary citizen, still less of a man accused of a political crime. And to tell the truth, those nationalist socialists were citizens who were accused of a political crime, and the terms of the accusation were such that it could not be described otherwise. Here we have an important question of principle. How is internationalism to be understood? Lenin, December 30, 1922, taken down by M.V. Continuation of the notes, December 31st, 1922. In my writings on the national question, I have already said that an abstract presentation of the question of nationalism in general is of no use at all. A distinction must necessarily be made between the nationalism of an oppressor nation and that of an oppressed nation, the nationalism of a big nation and that of a small nation. In respect of the second kind of nationalism, we, nationals of a big nation, have nearly always been guilty, in historic practice, of an infinite number of cases of violence. Furthermore, we commit violence and insult an infinite number of times without noticing it. It is sufficient to recall my Volga reminiscences of how non-Russians are treated, how the Poles are not called by any other name than Polyachiska, how the Tatar is nicknamed Prince, how the Ukrainians are always Kulkals, and the Georgians and other Caucasian nationals always Caucasians. That is why internationalism on the part of oppressors, or great nations, as they are called, though they are only great in their violence, only great as bullies, must consist not only in the observance of the formal equality of nations, but even in an inequality of the oppressor nation, the great nation, that must make up for the inequality which obtains in actual practice. Anybody who does not understand this has not grasped the real proletarian attitude to the national question. He is still essentially petty bourgeois in his point of view and is, therefore, sure to descend to the bourgeois point of view. What is important for the proletarian? For the proletarian, it is not only important, it is absolutely essential that he should be assured that the non-Russians place the greatest possible trust in the proletarian class struggle. What is needed to ensure this? Not merely formal equality. In one way or another, by one's attitude or by concessions, it is necessary to compensate the non-Russian for the lack of trust, for the suspicion and the insults to which the government of the dominant nation subjected them in the past. I think it is unnecessary to explain this to Bolsheviks, to communists in greater detail. And I think that in the present instance, as far as the Georgian nation is concerned, we have a typical case in which a genuinely proletarian attitude makes profound caution, thoughtfulness, and a readiness to compromise a matter of necessity for us. The Georgian, Stalin, who is neglectful of this aspect of the question, or who carelessly flings about accusations of nationalist socialism, whereas he himself is a real and true nationalist socialist, and even a vulgar great Russian bully, violates, in substance, the interests of proletarian class solidarity, for nothing holds up the development and strengthening of proletarian class solidarity so much as national injustice. Offended nationals are not sensitive to anything so much as to the feeling of equality and the violation of this equality, if only through negligence or jest, to the violation of that equality by their proletarian comrades. That is why, in this case, it is better to overdo rather than underdo the concessions and leniency towards the national minorities. That is why, in this case, the fundamental interest of proletarian class struggle requires that we never adopt a formal attitude to the national question, but always take into account the specific attitude of the proletarian of the oppressed or small nation towards the oppressor or great nation. Lenin, Taken down by MV, December 31st, 1922. Continuation of the notes, December 31st, 1922. What practical measures must be taken in the present situation? Firstly, we must maintain and strengthen the Union of Socialist Republics. Of this there can be no doubt. This measure is necessary for us, and it is necessary for the world communist proletariat in its struggle against the world bourgeoisie and its defense against bourgeois intrigues. Secondly, the Union of Socialist Republics must be retained for its diplomatic apparatus. By the way, this apparatus is an exceptional component of our state apparatus. We have not allowed a single influential person from the old czarist apparatus into it. All sections with any authority are composed of communists. That is why it has already won for itself, this may be said boldly, the name of a reliable communist apparatus, purged to an incomparably greater extent of the old czarist, bourgeois, and petty bourgeois elements than that which we have had to make do with in other people's commissariats. Thirdly, exemplary punishment must be inflicted on Comrade Orjonikidze. I say this all the more regretfully, as I am one of his personal friends and have worked with him abroad, and the investigation of all the material which Dzerzhinsky's commission has collected must be completed or started over again to correct the enormous mass of wrongs and biased judgments which it doubtlessly contains. The political responsibility for all this truly great Russian nationalist campaign must, of course, be laid on Stalin and Dzerzhinsky. Fourthly, the strictest rules must be introduced on the use of the national language in the non-Russian republics of our Union, and these rules must be checked with special care. There is no doubt that our apparatus being what it is, there is bound to be, on the pretext of unity in the railway service, unity in the fiscal service, and so on, a mass of truly Russian abuses. Special ingenuity is necessary for the struggle against these abuses, not to mention special sincerity on the part of those who undertake this struggle. A detailed code will be required, and only the nationals living in the republic in question can draw it up at all successfully. And then we cannot be sure in advance that as a result of this work, we shall not take a step backward at our next Congress of Soviets, i.e., retain the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics only for military and diplomatic affairs, and in all other respects restore full independence to the individual people's commissariats. It must be borne in mind that the decentralization of the people's commissariats and the lack of coordination in their work as far as Moscow and other centers are concerned can be compensated sufficiently by party authority if it is exercised with sufficient prudence and impartiality. The harm that can result to our state from a lack of unification between the national apparatuses and the Russian apparatus is infinitely less than that which will be done not only to us, but to the whole international, and to the hundreds of millions of the peoples of Asia, which is destined to follow us onto the stage of history in the near future. It would be unpardonable opportunism if, on the eve of debut of the East, just as it is awakening, we undermined our prestige with its people, even if only by the slightest crudity or injustice towards our own non-Russian nationalities. The need to rally against the imperialists of the West who are defending the capitalist world is one thing. There can be no doubt about that, and it would be superfluous for me to speak about my unconditional approval of it. It is another thing when we ourselves lapse, even if only in trifles, into imperialist attitudes towards oppressed nationalities, thus undermining all our principled sincerity, all our principled defense of the struggle against imperialism. But the morrow of world history will be a day when the awakening peoples oppressed by imperialism are finally aroused and the decisive, long, and hard struggle for their liberation begins. Lenin, December 31st, 1922, taken down by MV.